Welcome to the episode of This Ain't No Picnic. Today is a different one. We got an interview. So we're bringing you knowledge from other sources today.
Yeah, we're bringing you knowledge from Professor Emeritus Robert Hackett, who taught at the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University. His research writings and concerns cover very integral social democratic and progressive topics such as peace journalism, media democratization, and more broadly, the roles that communication technologies play in shaping our views on political events, social issues, and journalistic objectivity. His last two books, written collaboratively, were Journalism and Climate Crisis, Public Engagement, Media Alternatives in 2017, and Expanding Peace Journalism, Comparative and Critical Approaches in 2011. As well, he is a contributor to alternative news outlets such as Rabble.ca, The Tyee, and he helped co-found Newswatch Canada, OpenMedia.ca, and Media Democracy Days. And in 2018, Robert Hackett received the Warren Gill Award for decades spent championing social justice, media democratization, and a whole other host of other grassroots issues.
And he's here today to discuss his latest report, which is entitled Jobs versus the Environment, Mainstream and Alternative Media Coverage of Pipeline Controversies, which he penned alongside Philippa R. Adams in December 2018. This report seeks to outline the differences between mainstream and alternative media by analyzing their reporting around the Kinder Morgan protests, which happened in late 2014, and the period of early 2016 when the BC government declared its qualified opposition to the pipeline. We have a link to the report in the description if you'd like to read it yourself. It's a very interesting report and well thought out, so it's worth a look for sure. We're going to get right to it, though, and here's the interview.
Feast with your ears.
Feast for the streets.
So, all right, today we're joined by retired Professor Robert Hackett from the Simon Fraser University School of Communications. Professor, how are you this morning?
Fine, thanks.
Okay, so we're going to just get to brass tacks and try to explore some of the key points of your jobs versus the environment paper. Now, right from the get-go, what really struck us as an important finding in the paper was the all-around lack of labor and union perspectives in both mainstream and alternative media outlets, especially when covering various issues and concerns surrounding pipeline construction in this country. So do you think this issue of pipeline construction typifies a general divide between Canadian progressivism and labor indicative of this era, or is this a problem that has always hounded the left?
Well, I think that that's not a problem. It's being characteristic of the left. I mean, the CCF and NDP, Social Democratic parties in Canada, were founded with the active support of Labour, particularly the NDP, back in 1961. So I think what has happened is an unfortunate perception that job creation and environmental protection are mutually exclusive, or that there's a trade-off between the two. And I think that's happened in the last 10 or 20 years, partly because of the perceived middle-class basis of the green or environmental movement, as well as some unions, certainly not all, are looking in terms of short-term job creation through construction and fossil fuel mega projects, rather than longer-term strategies for creating, sustainable jobs, for the long term. So I think that the jobs versus environment dichotomy is a false one. There are far more jobs per dollar invested in renewable energy and in a greener economy through investing in building retrofitting or in public transit construction than there are in the short term creation of construction jobs for, say, pipelines from the Alberta Athabasca bitumen sands.
It seems that what you're putting forward there is generally the position of alternative media, but like you say in your report, legacy media, which is the more traditional forms of media, still dictate a lot of the conversation and bias. And at the end of page 21 of your report, you describe the systematic nature of that media bias, and I was wondering, s- since those are things that are true, but they don't necessarily. The problem is that it's not dominating the conversation, and I was wondering, how do you find that we could, society as a whole, should address that bias that comes from the media? Because, as you say, it's not really a centralized problem; it's more systematic in nature, and
It is.
more.
Yeah. So
Oh yes, go ahead.
I think that democratic media reform is actually part and parcel of the struggle for a greener and more sustainable economy, because it's going to be more difficult to adopt greener policies if you've got a media system that is dominated by corporate entities like Postmedia that are hostile to a transition away from a fossil fuel economy. And there's a number of ways in which the corporate media are tied to fossil fuel interests, whether it's through corporate ownership, dependence on advertising revenue from big companies, mutual ties with finance. All 5 Canadian major banks are invested in the bitumen sands, and the overdevelopment, I would say, of the so-called oil sands or tar sands. And more specifically, if you look at Postmedia, it has arrangements with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers to produce advertorials, that is, material that looks like a regular news feature story, but is actually, in effect, propaganda for the gas and oil industry. And that goes back to about 2013, when the National Observer, an online news magazine, reported that Postmedia and CAP, the CAPP, had an arrangement called Thought Leadership to produce those kinds of advertorials. Much more recently, this year, we find that Postmedia, which owns about 17 major daily newspapers in Canada, is lusting after some of the money from Alberta Premier Jason Kenney's War Room, where he wants the Alberta government, under the United Progressive Conservatives, or the United Conservative Party, want to basically take on environmental groups, and through basically propaganda and potentially intimidation, and that would include advertorials of the type that we just discussed. So Postmedia is very much on board with what we might call the petrobloc, which is an informal alliance between actors, and I'm borrowing from my colleague Bob Neubauer at Simon Fraser University. The petrobloc is an informal alliance between actors like oil companies, the banks that finance them, particular political parties, industry-backed think tanks and advocacy groups, as well as, I would argue, the industry-captured government regulatory agencies like the National Energy Board and segments of the corporate media.
Now, yes, did you have anything else to add?
No, that's okay.
So I wonder, like, with the rise of Postmedia, in line sort of with the Harper government from 2005 till 2015, or 2006 to 2015. Was that sort of everything that had gone into the Harper branding and the Harper legacy leading up to his prime ministership? Was something like this kind of ascendancy of the big emitters, the extraction capital industries, the petrobloc, was this sort of like a mandate of theirs that they've been brewing up since the 80s or the 90s? Has this been a long time coming?
You mean the Postmedia?
Postmedia, yeah. Just were they hoping for that kind of control of Canadian media before its actual conception? Like, was that an idea? Do you think that had been brewing in their ranks?
Well, I don't. I think Postmedia was not always owned by the American hedge funds that it now is. I mean, it's if you trace its history back, it was previously owned by the Aspers, based in Winnipeg. And they were not necessarily supporters of Harper or the Conservatives. I think they put their own corporate interests first, and they'll work with whatever government is in power. So I don't think they had some sort of conspiracy to bring Harper to power. I think that's they are tied with an extractivist economy rather than any particular political party.
Right.
Which includes all of the parties and sort of implicates the whole sort of neoliberal attitude of our
they'll
government.
work with and pressure whatever party is in power. I see something similar happening to the British Columbia NDP now, actually, because the BC government, even though on paper it opposes the Trans Mountain Pipeline from the tar sands to a port in Vancouver and Burnaby, it has also approved the Site C Dam and the development of LNG, the fracked gas, so-called liquefied natural gas, a huge project in northeastern BC, which in its own way is as bad as environmentally as the oil sands in Athabasca. And it will create, a few hundred, maybe 3,500 short-term construction jobs, but very few long-term jobs. That's not the way forward to a sustainable economy in the long run.
Yeah, it also seems like you've also laid out in your findings in the report that they are the petrobloc and those business interests are planning on introducing automation like driverless trucks. You mentioned in the report. Are there other types of would there be more jobs that are probably going to be lost through automation going forward? Do you think?
Well, that's right. I mean, it's not just in the extractivist or oil and gas sector. I think that's an even bigger social problem that takes us beyond the realm of this particular report of the role of media in extractivism. That's a big issue for all governments. That automation and so-called artificial intelligence (AI) is going to have a huge impact throughout the economy, which raises the question of the relationship between incomes and actual paid employment. We need to rethink that whole thing. But again, that takes us way beyond the topic of this report. But what I would say, though, is that there hasn't been enough attention paid to the employment drawbacks or the limitations of employment on exporting Canadian resources as quickly as possible in unrefined states. Right? There isn't enough value added to bitumen, for example, that is being exported to the United States or potentially to Asia. So that means that jobs are being exported. And on top of that, there's now an emerging campaign around the question of taxpayer subsidies to the oil and gas sector. The IMF estimates, I just saw a report I find hard to believe, but that Canada subsidizes fossil fuels by $58 billion a year.
Do you find it hard to believe that in too high or too low of a number?
I find that sounds like a high estimate, but I think it probably includes environmental costs, including the billions of dollars in unremediated abandoned oil and gas wells, particularly in the prairies. But more direct costs are several billion, in terms of write-offs and direct subsidies. You might add to that the overpayment by the federal government for purchasing the Trans Mountain Pipeline a year ago. I think most analysts would say that the Canadian government paid more than it was actually worth. So that's a kind of subsidy. In fact, the very purchase of that pipeline can be considered a subsidy because it would likely have folded altogether were it not for the Trudeau government's intervention.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that the TMX has been exempt from in the new USMCA, so it's still able to be it's still be able to receive non-market assistance from the government, and it's no longer. That was from a report that I got off Rabble.ca.
Yeah, right, under the terms of the new free trade agreement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
which I think you guys have looked at more carefully than I have, but we still have some version of the proportionality clause left over from the previous NAFTA agreement, by which Canada, in the event of an interruption in international oil supplies, Canada cannot prioritize Canadians in terms of our own oil and gas. That we have to ship a certain proportion to the United States under the terms of that the original NAFTA agreement. And I understand that's pretty much the same in the current one. So we don't have, unlike most other advanced economies, the OECD countries, there's only one or two, including Canada, that does not have its own strategic energy supply in the event of international supply disruptions.
So I just would like to move on and ask a question about alternative media's place, because if there is a petrobloc and our government has kind of lost has lost a lot of control to corporations and special interests in that way, if we are to make democratizing the media a major step, like a major goal for the movement, if that does, in the event that that doesn't happen because of the current corporate control of our government, what would you suggest alternative media can do to counter legacy media's position as like a conversation definer? Because it seems like we're stuck always defining ourselves in their terms. And
yeah, it's a good question. How do we strengthen sort of progressive alternatives to the corporate media, which is pursuing largely a neoliberal and extractivist agenda, with some exceptions? I don't want to say that it's a monolith by any means. I mean, the Toronto Star, for example, is doing some good work, but if we want to balance out the debate, the political discussion in Canada, alternative media themselves, I think, are doing what they can in terms of building new business models through subscriptions, for example, crowd funding of particular topics in their news. I would look at two different models: the National Observer, which is subscription-based, and the Tyee, which relies more on donations and ownership support. There's also Rabble.ca, which has institutional sponsors. So there are several different kinds of models that that they're experimenting with. Discourse media is another one. So they're building their own business models, but I think it's up to us on the left to actively support them, both in terms of readership and financially.
Definitely.
I believe that's we've gone past 15 minutes, so those are all the questions that we have for this. So we thank you very much for joining us with this discussion, especially considering the fact that we hope to be representing the progressive form of media, especially from a Western Canadian, but all around a Canadian perspective. And seeing as your expertise has been in media relations and media dissemination, especially from a Canadian perspective, we thank you very much for joining us for this conversation.
Well, thanks, and good luck with your podcast.
Thank you very much.
This kind of work. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Take care.